Soldiers stand at strict attention as the flags of India and South Korea snap in the wind. A motorcade glides through the gates. Inside is South Korean President Lee Jae-myung. He is about to step onto the red carpet to meet Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Two men who control the destinies of powerful democracies, yet share a distinctly gritty history. One survived as a teenage factory worker. The other grew up selling tea on railway platforms. But as they shake hands, the diplomatic record shows a gap that contradicts their status as allies. Take a look at this timeline. Between 2018 and this exact moment in 2026, no South Korean president had visited India. 8 full years of silence at the highest level. Keep your eyes on that 8-year gap. While Seoul kept its distance, India grew into the world's 5th largest economy. It launched 104 satellites on a single rocket. It landed a rover on the moon's south pole. It surpassed China as the most populous nation on Earth. For a technologically advanced democracy like South Korea to ignore a market of that scale for almost a decade defies basic diplomatic logic. That absence points to an uncomfortable reality in Asian geopolitics, a deep, quiet friction between two nations that actually share an incredibly long memory. To understand why they drifted apart, we have to rewind long before modern borders existed. The year is 48 AD. A young princess named Suriratna set sail from the sacred city of Ayodhya, crossing the Bay of Bengal and the East China Sea. She arrives on the shores of the Gaya Kingdom in what is now Korea. She marries a local monarch, King Kim Suro. In the Korean chronicles, she becomes Ho Hwang-ok. Together, they establish the Gimhae Kim clan. Millions of modern South Koreans trace their direct bloodline back to this legendary Indian princess. This narrative lives in 13th century historical records and physical stone. In 2001, the two governments jointly installed this memorial park in South Korea to honor her. The connection is embedded in cultural memory, complete with shared Buddhist philosophy and symbols like the lotus and the Dharma wheel. The people of the Korean peninsula and the Indian subcontinent built a quiet civilizational bond that lasted centuries. Then the 20th century arrived, and history violently interrupted. By a strange twist of fate, both nations share the exact date of liberation from colonial rule, August 15th. Korea in 1945, India in 1947. But the warmth of that shared independence ended immediately. India plunged into the chaos of partition, while Korea was violently sliced along the 38th parallel. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, India, under Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, refused to pick a side. Nehru was architecting the non-aligned movement, a foreign policy doctrine asserting that India would not be a pawn for Washington or Moscow. Yet India did something remarkable. They deployed the 60th Parachute Field Ambulance Unit to the Korean peninsula. Over 300 Indian Army medical personnel arrived carrying stretchers instead of rifles, treating wounded soldiers from both north and south in the freezing snow. When the fighting finally paused in 1953, it was an Indian, Lieutenant General K.S. Thamaya, who chaired the commission, overseeing the exchange of over 22,000 prisoners of war, handling a volatile process with strict discipline. You might expect those actions to forge a lasting alliance. They didn't. South Korea, heavily backed by the U.S., viewed India's neutrality and friendly ties with North Korea with intense suspicion. Meanwhile, India was building a closed, state-controlled socialist economy. The two nations froze each other out for decades. India formalized ties with South Korea in 1973, but purposefully recognized North Korea at the exact same time. It was a diplomatic stalemate. It took a near-death experience to break the ice. By 1991, India's foreign exchange reserves ran so dangerously low that the government secretly airlifted 47 tons of gold to Europe to secure emergency loans. Faced with economic collapse, Finance Minister Manmohan Singh announced a radical pivot. India dismantled its socialist red tape and opened its markets. Simultaneously, the government launched the Look East policy, realizing the real economic momentum was happening with Asian manufacturing powers. South Korea was ready. Their massive family conglomerates, chaebols like Samsung and Hyundai, were facing rising wages at home and heavy protectionism in Western markets. They needed new places to build and sell. India's newly open, massive population was exactly what they were looking for. Korean corporations quietly infiltrated everyday Indian life. Hyundai broke ground in Chennai in 1996 and quickly rescued the stagnant Indian small car market. LG and Samsung soon dominated electronic shops. The Korean brand became a staple in Indian living rooms. Yet the political relationship lagged far behind. They were trading goods, but they were not trading trust. Between 2004 and 2015, diplomats tried to fix this. High-level visits produced free trade agreements and elevated the relationship to a special strategic partnership, a rare tier India usually reserves for deep security allies like France and the US. But the rhetoric didn't match the capital. This chart shows the stark reality of foreign direct investment in India from 2000 to 2025. Singapore poured in over $174 billion. The United States invested $70 billion. South Korea, just $6.69 billion. The hesitation came from bitter experience. In 2005, South Korean steel giant POSCO signed a massive $12 billion deal to build a plant in Odisha. It was supposed to be a landmark investment. Instead, it was strangled by land acquisition disputes, environmental delays, and local protests until it completely collapsed. That failure deeply scarred Korean business confidence. Both sides signed memorandums and posed for photos, but the economic machinery remained stalled. The partnership was hollow. Then the pandemic hit. Global supply chains, optimized for decades around cheap Chinese manufacturing, fractured. Countries suddenly realized the danger of outsourcing critical components to a single nation. For South Korea, this was an existential alarm. Its economy lives and dies by export trade, specifically memory chips and shipbuilding. These industries require flawless, uninterrupted access to raw materials and open markets. Any break in the chain threatens the entire national economy. Compounding the panic was the escalating US-China trade war. Washington began restricting semiconductor sales to Beijing and pressuring allies to follow. South Korea, heavily dependent on China for trade and the US for security, was squeezed in a vice. They had to diversify. India provided the manufacturing scale South Korea needed to pivot away from China. Its engineering talent and mineral reserves offered a viable alternative for the production of electric vehicle batteries and semiconductors. The calculus shifted. In a fracturing world, integrating with the Indian economy became a prerequisite for South Korean industrial survival. Which brings us back to Lee Jae-myung. He understands survival. As a teenage factory worker, he sanded metal parts until industrial chemicals permanently damaged his hands just to help his family survive. He educated himself through night school, became a human rights lawyer, and won the 2025 presidential election amid extreme political turbulence. When he looked at India, he saw a leader with an identical trajectory. Narendra Modi had built his own political empire from deep poverty. They met on the sidelines of global summits in late 2025, and observers noted a genuine chemistry. The two leaders spoke with the rapport of survivors. Having both fought their way in from the margins of history, they approached the summit with a shared understanding of power. As the sun set over New Delhi on the eve of the April 2026 summit, the central question remained. They had signed agreements before. They had made grand promises before, only to let bureaucracy kill it. But this time, President Lee brought 200 top executives with him, the heads of Samsung, LG, Hyundai, and POSCO. This was a business mission dressed in diplomatic clothes, engineered to physically lock their supply chains together. The broken global order left them no other choice. After 50 years of circling each other, navigating ancient ghosts, and Cold War paranoia, the geopolitical squeeze finally forced the fusion. From chips to ships, from talent to technology, and the forgotten partnership was finally awake. This image shows the two central players of the 2026 summit walking through the grounds of Hyderabad House. On April 20th, they entered a scheduled 40-minute meeting that eventually stretched to 82 minutes. For 50 years, the relationship between India and South Korea had been characterized by polite diplomatic gestures that rarely translated into economic or strategic momentum. Inside that room, President Lee Jae-myung and Prime Minister Narendra Modi circumvented standard diplomatic scripts. Lee drew a direct parallel between his own history as a factory worker and Modi's childhood as a tea seller, two men who had climbed to power from the absolute margins of their societies. That personal connection provided the raw chemistry needed to finally address the strategic underperformance of the past. It gave the summit an unusual energy, allowing the leaders to focus on operational goals rather than empty ceremony. This is Bharat Mandapam, where South Korea deployed its most powerful industrial delegation in history. The group included the CEOs of Samsung, Hyundai, LG, and POSCO, companies with a combined market capitalization that exceeds the GDP of several nations. To bridge the historical gap between intent and execution, they adopted the Joint Strategic Vision 2026-2030. This is an institutionalized roadmap that requires annual summit meetings and specific progress reports, effectively forcing both bureaucracies to stay on schedule. This aggressive corporate deployment establishes a joint manufacturing ecosystem. By integrating Korean expertise directly into Indian industrial zones, the two nations are creating production loops designed to remain stable even during regional crises. The first priority is an ambitious $50 billion trade target. Reaching this requires the fast-tracking of CEPA 2.0, an economic agreement specifically designed to eliminate the non-tariff barriers and regulatory hurdles that historically blocked Indian pharmaceutical and service exports. This data visualization highlights the technology gap this partnership aims to fill. South Korea controls roughly 70%. Under the new maritime framework, Korean firms will invest in block fabrication facilities for large vessels, providing the technical hardware that Indian shipyards currently lack. Combining Korean technological mastery with Indian industrial scale, the two nations are building a self-sustaining manufacturing loop that reduces reliance on external, high-risk suppliers. This tactical map shows the geopolitical pressure driving the partnership. Both nations face a shared anxiety regarding the China-Pakistan-North Korea axis and the increasing use of economic coercion to influence regional policy. These Indian naval warships highlight the defense implications of the shipbuilding agreement. This industrial base provides the shadow capability to build and maintain the naval frigates required to keep Indo-Pacific sea lanes open. This vast solar farm array represents the energy and resource strategy adopted at the summit. India and South Korea are coordinating as major energy buyers to increase their bargaining power, while simultaneously developing a pipeline for critical minerals to ensure their semiconductor industries remain independent of Chinese inputs. Beyond military and economic logic, there is an organic cultural connection. K-pop, Korean cinema, and entertainment have built a genuine affinity between the two populations, creating a foundation for long-term cooperation that goes deeper than government policy. While cold strategic realities may have initiated the deal, this level of cultural integration ensures that the partnership can survive shifts in the political climate. To reach this agreement, India accepted greater market competition for high-tech goods in exchange for massive capital investment. South Korea, in turn, offered cooperation in sensitive defense and naval technology that it rarely shares with non-allies. The summit resulted in 25 specific outcomes, ranging from MOUs on AI and digital infrastructure to frameworks for critical minerals and defense supply chains. This partnership provides South Korea with a vital third strategic pillar outside the influence of the US and China, while giving India a high-tech anchor for its broader Act East policy. The alignment of these two middle powers provides the structural economic architecture needed to anchor a democratic, rules-based order across the Indo-Pacific. This ancient ceremonial burial mound marks a cultural connection that predates modern states. It refers to the legend of an Indian princess who traveled to Korea in 48 AD, a story that has resonated between the two cultures for 2 millennia. In the modern era, both nations rebuilt themselves from the devastation of colonization and geographical division. Today, they are both democracies navigating a region increasingly defined by authoritarian pressure. President Lee Jae-myung noted that the possibilities between these two nations are endless, provided they continue the honesty that defined the 2026 summit. By substituting polite diplomacy with technical integration, the two nations are finally converting an ancient cultural affinity into a modern industrial reality. The thread first laid 2,000 years ago has finally become an operational alliance.